there it is, Sonic's big jump into 3D as well as a whole new console generation. It's just too bad that he didn't do it with something new. Yep, it's unfortunately true, but Sonic's big jump into the future was with a reworked Genesis game onto the Saturn, which is honestly funny to me because I thought it was the other way around. Like, they decided to squeeze a Saturn game onto the Genesis, but no. Now, the reason this version even exists is because the big Sonic game that was supposed to come out for the Saturn, Sonic Extreme, the development of it fell through and it just never came out. And out of the only 3 Sonic games to come out on the Saturn, this was the only one that wasn't a spin-off or a collection. And this would end up being the big Sonic game for the Saturn, since Extreme was cancelled. And that's just funny to me because this version of the game was never meant to exist at all. And another thing to factor in is that if you see this through the eyes of the console wars, this was Sega's answer to Super Mario 64. Since this was not only Sonic's big 3D debut, but also because it came out 5 months after Super Mario 64. Alright, now with the background to this game done, let's actually dive headfirst into the game itself. First up is the story, which follows Sonic as he visits his Flicky friends on Flicky Island, which is located in a different dimension. But when Sonic arrives, he finds the place to be overrun with badniks thanks to the always persistent Dr. Robotnik. And his plan this time around is to utilize the dimension hopping ability that the Flickies have in order to find and then collect the Chaos Emeralds. It is now up to Sonic to free the Flickies from their robotic imprisonment and once again save the day from the Mad Doctor. Now, the gameplay is that of an isometric 3D platformer, and the goal of the game is not to just simply get to the end of the stage as quickly as possible. It is instead to save the Flickies, as in each zone there are 3 or 4 sets of 5 Flickies that you must defeat the badnik that they are trapped inside of, then collect them, then deposit them into a giant warp ring, in order to get to the next section, and then repeat the process until you have finished the level. Which means that this game is less focused on speed and more on exploration, kinda like Sonic 1 and Sonic CD. Now, I'm gonna kinda shift gears here. I've already done a review for the Genesis version of this game, and to basically sum up that review is that although this game didn't control the best, like Sonic would slip around a lot and get caught on things, and the gameplay can be pretty repetitive, it was still a cool game to experience, and I was happy to have experienced it, since it was such a unique game in the series. And I was so enamored by it that I went out of my way to get a Sega Saturn because I wanted to play the Saturn port. And this is like the only way I could experience this game, since for whatever reason the Saturn port was never re-released outside of like a PC release that, I mean, you ever try getting really old 90s PC games to work on a modern day computer? So yeah, while the Genesis version of 3D Blast is like a part of every Sonic game collection that there is, the Saturn port is just kinda hung out to dry. Which I guess brings us to the new question of the video, which is the better version, the Genesis version or the Saturn port? And the second question of, is the Saturn version so good that it's worth going out and buying a Saturn just to play it? Alright, let's start this compare and contrast with what these games have in common, which are the level layouts and the bosses. Yep, every stage layout is the exact same as it was in the Genesis version. They don't try to mix things up at all or even like add a new level. I mean, there's even the exact same enemies, hazards, and even the same flickies. And the exact same thing for the bosses, nothing new. But I mean, for a direct port like this, it's kind of expected for nothing to be touched, so they could just get it out easier, especially considering, again, this was kind of a rushed game. And now we move on to what is different between these two versions. And to start that off is that they both have different intro and ending cutscenes. Now, the Genesis cutscenes aren't even really cutscenes, they're just mostly still shots with text under them, and they basically explain the plot, but you could make the argument that they aren't really needed, since
like every Sonic game before this didn't have an opening like text scroll or whatever. They just jumped right into the game once it started. But I mean, they aren't long and that imposing of you playing the game, so I guess they serve their purpose and they're fine. And they're even skippable, unlike the opening animation in Sonic 3. But I will say that the full motion video cutscene that plays when you first boot up the game is really impressive to see be played on a Genesis. And then on the Saturn, of course, it's going to look a whole lot better, as well as all the cutscenes actually having 100% movement in them, and no text dialogue or any dialogue at all. It's kind of like the Sonic CD opening, except obviously not animated. And the cutscene is just better. It actually shows Sonic doing something instead of just running, as he takes out a few badniks and frees flickies from them. So yeah, I guess this round would go to the Saturn version just for being more fun to watch. And yes, I do kinda acknowledge that this is a unfair battle since the Saturn was significantly more powerful than the Genesis. But I will still instate that the fact that they managed to get any video on the Genesis is probably more impressive than, well, just the Saturn's videos. Almost to the point of me wanting to call this round a draw. Next up we have the graphics. Now the Genesis version with the 3D models actually look pretty damn good. It's just unfortunate that the world surrounding them is honestly pretty bland. And it doesn't help that this game, for whatever reason, has a dull color palette, while the Saturn version gives the game a whole new breath of life, with the game now looking very much more colorful, and the environments themselves now having like a bunch of background elements happening within them, like there's animals running around and doing whatever now. And in some levels there's actually weather effects added in, and this is another round that goes to the Saturn for just simply being the more powerful console. Next up are the radically different special stages, and how you enter them in both games have not been changed, which is finding both Tails or Knuckles and then giving them 50 rings in order to enter the stage. But once you're actually in the special stage, it is like night and day. I mean, the Genesis's version of the special stages is just honestly some of the worst that I've ever seen. All it is just Sonic running across a bridge to collect rings and avoiding spikes. I mean, and then there's no challenge in it because they give you way too many rings, and on top of that you can't even fall off, and they're so boring that honestly you just want to get through them as quickly as possible and just be done with them. Then we have the Saturn's special stages, which are the admittedly overdone half-pipe, but I will say that this is probably one of the better done ones. You could actually see what's coming up ahead of you. There's enough rings that there's room for error, and there's no secondary character that can screw you over. And just in general, it's a whole lot of fun to play these, especially in comparison to the Borefest that is the Genesis version. As a side note, it really sucks how much they got neutered in the PC version. And this ends the special stage round with a clear winner going to the Saturn once again. But before I get off this topic completely, I do want to go over a few things real quick. Whoever you found in the Genesis version would either bring you to an easy, which was Tails, or a hard, which was Knuckles, version of the special stage. Or at least that's what I'm thinking it is, because the background is either like a blue sky or a lava pit. And on the other side of the coin, whenever you entered a special stage with either character, it would actually show a neat little animation of them flying you in. And there's even a cool little animation of Sonic giving you a thumbs up when you reach the halfway point. And another really neat small detail in the Saturn version was the fact that whenever you enter a tunnel, the ring sound effect gains an echo to reflect that. And the last thing I want to go over in this section is the weird change of how many Chaos Emeralds you can get within each zone. In the Genesis version, there is no restrictions at all, and you can continuously get them. And you can have all 7 by the earliest of the second act of Rusty Ruin Zone. While for whatever reason in the Saturn version you are restricted to 1 emerald per act,
meaning now the earliest you could get them is by the first act of Diamond Dust Zone, which is a pretty significant jump in levels. Alright, in the next round we have the miscellaneous things about both of these games, like the load times. And good god, the load times for the Saturn version is just awful. The game seems to take at least 1 to 2 minutes to load every time, and that time adds up to at least maybe possibly 25% of the gameplay time, or even more. And I can't really knock it against the Saturn version for this, because I mean, old disc games are notorious for loading this long, but it's just coming from the cartridge version, which cartridge games are just instant loaders, or near instant loaders. It's just such a downgrade. It really sucks to be out of the action for that long. What else is there? Oh, in the Saturn version, if you pause the game, there's maps of all the levels, which was not present in the Genesis version. And even though I didn't personally use them, I still do see the merit in them, since they would really help you if you get lost. And then finally we have the true final boss arena, with the Genesis version being a complete black void and the pads on the ground like trying to mimic stars, I suppose, while the Saturn version is more correct, with it being a continuation of Panic Puppet Zone. And despite its correctness, I still think that the Genesis version just looks cooler. I don't know, it kind of feels like you're just fighting in like a blank space, which is very appropriate for the final bosses in Sonic games. But in the end, I will give this category to the Genesis version, just simply because of how much the load times suck on the Saturn version. Alright, with that all done, let's now move on to the music round. And to start off this section on music, I'm going to say how bizarre it is that the Saturn version has no music on its main menu, or even sound effects. It's just nothing but silence. Alright, with that off my chest, I will now continue with the Saturn's version soundtrack. And to start off, I will say that the music in this version is very atmospheric, much like the Japanese and European soundtrack of Sonic CD. I mean, in some tracks, you really can hear the Sonic CD influence. I also believe that this version of the game harbors one of the best, if not the best, pieces of Sonic music of all time in its version of Rusty Ruin Zone, as well as one of the most overlooked Sonic songs, You're My Hero. And then there's the music for the Genesis version, which feels like an evolutional culmination of the Sonic music on the system, since it came out so late in the Genesis's lifespan that the composers seem to have a full understanding of the system and managed to push the console's sound capabilities to its limits. And when it comes down to which of the two soundtracks I would prefer, I would say it would be the Genesis's version. This is because the first half of the Saturn soundtrack is great, but once you get to the second half, everything after Diamond Dust Zone, it just loses me. And I mean, it's not bad necessarily, but it's just kinda generic. While the Genesis's soundtrack is great all the way through. I mean, if you really want a perfect example of what I mean here, just compare the music tracks for Volcano Valley Zone. And yeah, that's another round for the Genesis version. And just like before we move on, I want to quickly go over two little things. There's a bit of irony in the Saturn soundtrack, which, although it is inspired by the Japanese and European version of Sonic CD's soundtrack, it pulls a US Sonic CD soundtrack with the final boss, and how it's just a more intense version of the regular boss theme, and how the Genesis version has the added bonus of being able to be listened on through headphones. You can't do that on Saturn. Alright, let's wrap this up in the conclusion. Now, in the end, it does seem that both versions of this game have their merits and their downfalls, but in the end, the score is 3-2,
So that technically means that the Saturn version is the winner here. Or at least it would be if the point didn't still stand that the Genesis version is much easier to get a hold of, thus giving it another win in the round of accessibility, which completely ties up the score. And when it really comes down to it, both of these games being the same at their core gameplay-wise, it really doesn't matter what Saturn exclusive stuff you would be missing out on, as you would still get the full experience of what the game itself has to offer in the original Genesis version. Or in other words, no, it is not worth it to go out and buy a Saturn just to play its version of Sonic 3D Blast. And in the secret final round, we have the cheat codes in which you must type in the word Barracuda while using a controller before the title screen ends. And then you unlock the selection of stages. And then we have the Saturn version. And how hard is it to unlock the cheats on here? Well, here's how hard it is. You go back to the start screen just like the other one, however long that takes. And you know how hard this one is? You hold down C, and hit the start button. So much harder. So, even though I put in the code, it doesn't look any different than a normal game. I mean, where's the stage select? Well, actually, all the codes are found within the menu, and then you have to press a button to get something. In other words, there's actually more selection here than the Genesis version, even though it's easier to put in. Like, if I wanted an extra life, I would hit X. And then I have an extra life. But then if I wanted to skip to the end of the game, I could actually hit C, but I'm not going to do that. And then if you really wanted to, you could just hit Z, and then you have all the Chaos Emeralds. I mean, the Genesis really got shafted in this round, didn't it?